Araminta Ross was born into slavery around 1822 on a Maryland plantation. She never knew her exact birth date. Enslaved people weren't given that dignity. Their lives were property not worth recording with precision. Her mother, Harriet Green, called her Minty. She was one of 9 children, though some had already been sold away before Minty was old enough to remember them. The fear of separation haunted every enslaved family. You could go to sleep with your family intact and wake up to find your child, your parent, your sibling gone forever. The Brodess Plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland, was Minty's prison from birth. She learned early that being born black in America meant being born into suffering. White people owned her body, her labor, her future. They could beat her, sell her, work her to death. The law protected them, not her. Her earliest memories were of hunger. Enslaved people received minimal food, cornmeal, salt pork, whatever scraps the white family didn't want. Children like Minty were often left to forage for themselves, eating whatever they could find. She also remembered cold. Enslaved children received 1 rough shirt per year. No shoes, no coat, no blanket. During Maryland winters, Minty would sleep near the fireplace, trying to stay warm enough to survive the night. But most of all, she remembered fear. The constant, crushing fear that defined enslaved life. Fear of the whip. Fear of being sold. Fear of watching your loved ones disappear. Fear of resisting, because resistance meant death. White people called slavery natural, claimed black people were content with bondage, insisted they were doing enslaved people a favor by providing food and shelter. These were lies designed to justify evil. Minty learned the truth early. Slavery was violence. It was theft of human lives. It was a system built on treating people as animals, and it survived because white people profited from black suffering. Even as a small child, Minty understood something fundamental. This was wrong. She didn't have the words yet to explain why, but she felt it in her bones. Human beings weren't meant to be owned. That understanding would transform Araminta Ross into Harriet Tubman, the woman who would risk everything to destroy slavery from within. At age 5, Minty was rented out to another family. Slave owners often rented enslaved children to neighbors, earning money while the child worked for someone else. Minty was too young to work in fields, so she was assigned household tasks. Her first job was watching a baby. She had to keep the infant quiet while the white mother slept. If the baby cried and woke the mother, Minty was whipped. She was 5 years old, responsible for a task impossible for a child, punished violently when she failed. One morning, the baby wouldn't stop crying. Minty tried everything, rocking, singing, walking. Nothing worked. The mother woke up furious. She grabbed a whip and beat Minty's small body until blood ran down her back. Minty ran away. A 5-year-old child, bleeding from a whipping, fled into the woods. She hid for several days, surviving on scraps she found near pig pens. Eventually, hunger drove her back. More whippings awaited. She was returned to the Brodess Plantation, deemed too young and difficult for household work. But the lesson had been taught. Resistance brought pain. Obedience was survival. Many enslaved people internalized this lesson, learning to endure rather than resist. But Minty drew a different conclusion. If they would beat a 5-year-old child for failing an impossible task, then the system itself was beyond redemption. It couldn't be reformed or reasoned with. It could only be escaped or destroyed. At age 7, Minty was rented out again, this time to check muskrat traps in freezing rivers. She developed measles and became desperately ill. The family sent her back to Brodess, not wanting to lose their investment if she died. Her mother nursed her back to health using herbs and prayers. Harriet Green was a deeply religious woman who taught her children that God saw their suffering and would deliver them from bondage, just as He'd delivered the Israelites from Egypt. "You remember Moses, baby," her mother would whisper. "God sent Moses to free His people. God will send someone to free us too." Minty listened to these stories with fierce attention. Moses didn't ask Pharaoh nicely to free the slaves. He demanded it. And when Pharaoh refused, God sent plagues. Freedom wasn't given. It was taken. These early years taught Minty 3 lessons that would define her life. Slavery was absolute evil. God demanded freedom for the oppressed, and liberation required action, not patience. At age 12, Minty experienced an event that would shape the rest of her life. She was working in a dry goods store when an enslaved man tried to escape. The overseer demanded Minty help restrain him. She refused. The overseer grabbed a 2-pound weight from the counter and threw it at the escaping man. He missed. The weight struck Minty in the forehead with devastating force. Her skull fractured. Blood poured down her face. She nearly died. For months, she drifted between consciousness and delirium. No doctor was called. Enslaved people didn't receive medical care unless their owner thought the investment was worth protecting. Minty's mother tended her with whatever remedies she knew. Minty survived, but the injury left permanent damage. For the rest of her life, she would experience sudden sleeping spells, moments when she'd fall unconscious without warning. The condition, likely a form of epilepsy caused by traumatic brain injury, made her seem unreliable to potential slave buyers. But Minty interpreted the injury differently. During her unconscious episodes, she experienced vivid visions, dreams that felt like messages from God. She saw herself leading people to freedom. She saw rivers she'd need to cross and paths through darkness. She saw herself as Moses, called by God to free her people. White people might see a damaged slave, worth less on the market. Minty saw divine purpose. God had marked her for a mission. The injury that should have destroyed her instead became the source of her spiritual power. She also learned something practical from the incident: her refusal to help capture the escaping man. Even at 12, even facing consequences, she'd chosen resistance over compliance. That choice defined who she was. After recovering enough to work, Minty was assigned to field labor. This was usually considered punishment. Field work was harder, more brutal than household service. But Minty preferred it. She grew strong from the physical labor. She learned the land, the woods, the waterways. She studied the North Star and memorized routes. She was preparing for something she didn't yet fully understand, building skills she would need for a mission that hadn't yet revealed itself completely. The overseer who'd thrown the weight was never punished. The enslaved man who'd tried to escape was caught, whipped publicly, and sold south to the brutal plantations where enslaved people died quickly from overwork and abuse. Minty watched and learned. Attempting escape meant terrible consequences. But so did staying enslaved. The question wasn't whether to risk everything for freedom. The question was when. In 1844, at around age 22, Minty married John Tubman, a free black man. She changed her name from Araminta to Harriet, taking her mother's name. She became Harriet Tubman. Marriage was one of the few joys available to enslaved people. But it was also complicated. Harriet was enslaved, John was free. Their children, if they had any, would be enslaved, inheriting their mother's condition according to Maryland law. Harriet loved John, but she loved freedom more. She began talking to him about escaping north, about finding a way to buy her freedom, about the possibility of a life where they were both free and safe. John didn't understand her urgency. He was free. Life wasn't perfect, but he'd adapted. Why risk everything for the uncertain dream of escape? The penalties for attempted escape were severe. Harriet could be sold south, beaten, or killed. Was freedom worth that risk? For Harriet, the question was insulting. Of course, freedom was worth any risk. How could John, who'd never been enslaved, understand the desperation of bondage? How could someone who could walk freely not comprehend the suffocation of being owned? Their marriage began to strain under this fundamental disagreement. John thought Harriet was being reckless. Harriet thought John was being cowardly. She'd married a free man, hoping he'd help her gain freedom. Instead, he seemed content with her remaining enslaved as long as he was comfortable. In 1849, Harriet heard devastating news. She was going to be sold. Edward Brodess, her owner, had died. His widow was selling off enslaved people to pay debts. Harriet and her brothers were on the list. Being sold south was every enslaved person's nightmare. Maryland slavery was brutal, but slavery in the Deep South, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, was a death sentence. Enslaved people worked in rice and cotton fields under conditions designed to extract maximum labor before they died. Few survived more than a few years. Harriet made her decision. She would escape. She asked John to come with her. He refused. He said she was crazy, that she'd be caught and killed, that she should accept her fate. Harriet looked at the man she'd married and realized he would never understand. Freedom wasn't something she wanted. It was something she required. It was oxygen. She would die trying to breathe rather than accept suffocation. She began planning alone. Harriet convinced 2 of her brothers to escape with her. They left at night, using darkness as cover. Harriet had been gathering information for years: which routes were safest, which white people might help, how to follow the North Star toward Pennsylvania and freedom. They traveled through woods and swamps, avoiding roads where slave catchers patrolled. Every sound was potential danger. Dogs barking in the distance could mean pursuers. Voices could mean capture. The night was full of terrors, but staying enslaved was more terrifying. After several hours, Harriet's brothers became frightened. The reality of escape was harder than imagining it. They would be hunted. If caught, they'd be whipped publicly, possibly killed as examples. Their families might be punished for their escape attempt. "We should go back," one brother said. "Maybe they haven't noticed we're gone yet. Maybe we can return before anyone knows." Harriet was furious. "Go back to slavery after we've come this far? Are you insane?" But her brothers were convinced. They turned around, forcing Harriet to choose: continue alone or return with them. She chose to return, knowing she'd try again. Going alone was too dangerous on this first attempt, but she promised herself, next time, nothing would stop her. They returned to the plantation. Miraculously, their absence hadn't been noticed. They slipped back into their quarters, resuming their enslaved lives as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed for Harriet. She'd tasted the possibility of escape. She'd walked toward freedom, even if only for a few hours. She knew the path now. She knew the fear could be overcome. She knew she would try again, and next time she wouldn't turn back. She also learned an important lesson. Most people prefer familiar suffering to uncertain freedom. Her brothers chose the known horror of slavery over the unknown dangers of escape. Harriet understood she was different. She would risk death rather than accept bondage. Over the following weeks, Harriet carefully planned her solo escape. She couldn't tell anyone. Not her brothers, not her husband, not even her mother. Trust meant risk, and she couldn't afford betrayal. She memorized songs that contained coded messages about escape routes. Follow the drinking gourd referred to the Big Dipper constellation, pointing to the North Star. Wade in the water meant using streams to throw off tracking dogs. These songs, sung in fields and quarters, were maps disguised as spirituals. Harriet also connected with the Underground Railroad, a network of abolitionists, both black and white, who helped enslaved people escape north. A Quaker woman in the area was rumored to help fugitives. Harriet made contact, confirming the rumors. Everything was ready. The only question was when. In September 1849, Harriet Tubman escaped alone. She left at night, following routes she'd memorized. She traveled through forests, waded through streams, hid during the day, and moved at night. She was terrified, but determined. Every step north was a step toward freedom. Every mile between her and the plantation was a mile between bondage and humanity. She reached the Quaker woman's house. The woman provided food, directions, and the name of the next safe house on the route. This was how the Underground Railroad worked, a series of stations where fugitives could rest briefly before continuing their journey. Harriet traveled through Delaware, a slave state, into Pennsylvania, a free state. When she crossed the state line, she later described the feeling. "I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came up like gold through the trees, and I felt like I was in heaven." She was free. For the first time in her life, Harriet owned herself. No one could sell her, beat her, or claim her body as property. She could walk where she wanted, speak freely, live as a human being rather than an animal. She found work in Philadelphia, taking jobs as a cook and domestic worker. The pay was small, but it was hers. She rented a room, her own space that no one could take from her. She ate food she'd purchased with her own labor. But freedom wasn't what she'd expected. Yes, she was free legally, but her family remained enslaved. Her mother, her siblings, her friends, all still suffering under the whip, still facing the constant threat of being sold, still living as property. Harriet realized something that would define the rest of her life. Personal freedom meant nothing while her people remained in bondage. She'd escaped, but that wasn't enough. Real freedom required freeing others. Most escaped slaves stayed free, building new lives far from their former plantations. It was too dangerous to return. Slave catchers hunted fugitives. The Fugitive Slave Act meant escaped slaves could be captured even in free states and returned to bondage. Going back south meant risking re-enslavement or death. Harriet didn't care about the risks. She'd seen heaven. Now she had to guide others there. She made a decision that shocked everyone who knew her. She would return to Maryland and rescue her family. People called her crazy, but Harriet believed God had called her to this mission. She'd been given freedom so she could free others. Moses didn't stay free while his people suffered in Egypt. Harriet wouldn't either. In 1850, Harriet made her first return trip to Maryland. Her goal was to rescue her niece Keziah and Keziah's 2 children who were about to be sold at auction. The plan was dangerous and complex. Keziah's free husband, John Bowley, would attend the auction. When bidding started, he would secretly spirit his family away before the sale was finalized. Harriet would meet them and guide them north. The plan worked perfectly. John brought his family to Harriet's hiding spot. She guided them through the same route she'd taken to freedom, using the network of safe houses she'd learned. They traveled at night, hid during the day, moved silently through dangerous territory. Harriet carried a pistol. She'd use it on slave catchers if necessary, or on fugitives who wanted to turn back. "You'll be free or die," she told them. She couldn't allow anyone to return and reveal underground railroad routes. They reached Philadelphia safely. Harriet had successfully rescued 3 people from slavery. She felt God's confirmation. This was her mission, her calling, her purpose. Over the next year, Harriet made multiple trips. She rescued her brother Moses and 2 other men. Then she returned for another brother and his family. Each trip was terrifyingly dangerous. But Harriet developed a system that worked. She always operated in winter when nights were longer, providing more darkness for travel. She always left on Saturday nights because newspapers printing runaway notices didn't publish on Sundays, giving her group a head start. She used disguises, sometimes dressing as a man, sometimes as an old woman. She carried drugs to quiet crying babies. She threatened violence against anyone who wanted to turn back. And she never lost a passenger. Not one. Every person she guided to freedom arrived safely. Slave owners were baffled. Enslaved people were disappearing, but no one could catch the person responsible. They called the mysterious rescuer Moses. They didn't know Moses was a 5-foot-tall woman who'd once been their property. Harriet's reputation grew in both enslaved and free black communities. People whispered about the woman who returned again and again, who never got caught, who'd been touched by God. White slave owners also heard the rumors. They put a price on Moses's head, eventually reaching $40,000, an enormous sum. Wanted posters went up offering rewards for the capture of the mysterious conductor. Harriet saw the posters and laughed. They were offering $40,000 for a woman they'd once valued at maybe $800 as enslaved property. She'd become more valuable free than she'd ever been enslaved. Harriet's greatest wish was to rescue her husband John. Despite their disagreements, she still loved him. She'd gained freedom and wanted to share it with him. In 1851, she returned to Maryland to bring John to Philadelphia. She'd saved money, had contacts, knew the routes. Everything was prepared. But when she arrived and sent word to John, she received devastating news. He'd remarried. He'd found another wife and had no interest in escaping north with Harriet. The betrayal was crushing. While Harriet had been risking her life to free others, dreaming of reuniting with her husband, he'd replaced her and moved on. The marriage was over. Harriet could have returned north immediately, heartbroken and empty-handed. Instead, she channeled her pain into purpose. If John didn't want freedom, others did. She gathered a group of enslaved people ready to escape and guided them north. She learned an important lesson. You couldn't force people to want freedom. Some preferred the security of bondage to the risk of liberty. Harriet would focus her efforts on those brave enough to run toward freedom, not those content to remain in chains. Her family remained her priority. In 1857, she made one of her most dangerous trips, returning to rescue her aging parents, both around 70 years old. Her father, Ben Ross, had been freed years earlier. Her mother, Harriet Green, was legally freed, but her owner had never filed the proper papers. Technically, she could be re-enslaved at any time. Both were too old to walk the grueling journey north. Harriet solved the problem creatively. She built a crude wheeled cart and used horses to pull her parents through part of the journey. When the terrain became too rough for the cart, she and other rescuers carried them. It took weeks, but she got her elderly parents to freedom in Canada. Her mother, the woman who'd taught her about Moses and freedom, finally experienced liberty in her old age. She died free, never to fear slavery again. Harriet also tried to rescue her sister Rachel and Rachel's 2 children. But Rachel died before Harriet could reach her. The grief was terrible, but Harriet continued her missions. Every person she freed was a blow against slavery, a tribute to those she couldn't save. Harriet developed a sophisticated operation. The Underground Railroad wasn't literally underground or a railroad. It was a network of safe houses, coded messages, and brave people willing to risk everything to help fugitives. Harriet became one of its most effective conductors, guides who personally led enslaved people to freedom. She made approximately 19 trips over 11 years, personally freeing about 70 people. She also gave instructions that helped dozens more escape on their own. Her methods were brilliant and ruthless. She trusted no one completely. She changed routes frequently to avoid patterns that slave catchers might detect. She used disguises, forged papers, and deception. She also carried a gun and wasn't afraid to use it. When fugitives became frightened and wanted to turn back, Harriet would pull out her pistol and say, "You go on or die." She couldn't allow anyone to return and potentially reveal routes or safe houses under torture. This hardness shocked some people. How could a woman of faith threaten to kill people she was trying to save? But Harriet understood something others didn't. In war against evil, mercy to the weak-willed meant death for everyone. One person breaking under interrogation could destroy the entire network, condemning hundreds to continued slavery. She used songs as signals. Certain spirituals, sung in certain ways, communicated messages. "Go down, Moses" meant a conductor was nearby. "Swing low, sweet chariot" meant time to escape. Enslaved people learned to listen for these coded messages. She also relied on free black communities and white abolitionists. Quakers, especially, were reliable allies, religiously opposed to slavery and willing to hide fugitives. Black churches provided sanctuary and resources. Both groups risked legal punishment to support the Underground Railroad. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made Harriet's work even more dangerous. This federal law required northern states to return escaped slaves to their owners. It meant freedom in Pennsylvania was no longer guaranteed. Slave catchers could legally operate in free states. Harriet adapted by extending routes to Canada. True freedom required crossing the Canadian border, where slavery was completely illegal and fugitives couldn't be extradited. Many of her later rescues ended in Ontario, where free black communities welcomed refugees from American slavery. By the mid-1850s, Harriet Tubman had become legendary. Enslaved people sang songs about her. Free black communities supported her financially. White abolitionists invited her to speak at their meetings, amazed by this small woman who accomplished what seemed impossible. She met Frederick Douglass, the famous formerly enslaved writer and speaker. Douglass admired Harriet enormously. He later wrote, "I have had the applause of the crowd, but you have the greater work. I have wrought in the day, but you in the night. The midnight sky and silent stars have been the witnesses of your devotion to freedom." Harriet also met John Brown, the radical abolitionist who believed slavery could only be ended through violence. Brown called Harriet General Tubman and wanted her help planning his raid on Harper's Ferry. Harriet supported Brown's goals but was sick during the planned raid and couldn't participate. Many historians believe that if she'd been there, her tactical brilliance might have changed the outcome. Brown's raid failed, and he was executed. But his willingness to use violence against slavery inspired many. Harriet's philosophy about violence was practical, not ideological. She preferred avoiding conflict when possible. Successful rescues meant no confrontations. But she wouldn't hesitate to use force if necessary. Freedom was worth fighting for, worth killing for, worth dying for. Slave owners hated and feared her. The reward for her capture reached $40,000, a fortune. Wanted posters described Moses as a dangerous fugitive. They never suspected Moses was a woman, a formerly enslaved person they'd once owned and dismissed as property. Harriet moved freely despite the bounty on her head. She used her small stature and unassuming appearance to her advantage. She'd dress as an old woman, bow her head subserviently, and walk right past slave catchers searching for the mythical Moses. She also used her sleeping spells strategically. When she needed time to think or observe without being noticed, she'd find a quiet spot and let one of her episodes occur. People would assume she was sick or disabled and leave her alone. Her faith sustained her through everything. Harriet believed absolutely that God directed her missions. She claimed her visions showed her routes, warned her of dangers, and confirmed when it was safe to proceed. Some people dismissed these claims as delusions caused by her head injury. But Harriet's success rate was undeniable. She never lost a passenger. She was never caught. Either God was truly guiding her, or her instincts and intelligence were so sharp they seemed supernatural. Harriet had strict rules for anyone traveling with her. Breaking these rules meant death, either hers or the fugitives, or possibly both. Rule 1: absolute silence when she commanded it. One noise at the wrong moment could mean capture. Crying babies were drugged with paregoric. Adults who couldn't control their fear were left behind. Rule 2: keep moving no matter how tired, cold, or scared. Rest came only at safe houses. Stopping in between meant exposure and capture. Rule 3: trust her completely. If Harriet said hide, you hid immediately. If she said run, you ran. If she said stay still while slave catchers passed within feet, you stayed frozen. Her judgment had kept everyone alive so far. Rule 4: no turning back. Once the journey started, it ended in freedom or death. Harriet would shoot anyone who tried to return, not out of cruelty but necessity. A captured fugitive might be tortured into revealing routes and safe houses. These rules seemed harsh, but they worked. Harriet's perfect record proved her methods, however brutal, lives. She also had rules for herself. She prayed before every mission, asking God for guidance. She scouted routes carefully, memorizing every path, stream, and hiding place. She maintained absolute secrecy about upcoming rescues. Even people she trusted weren't told details until necessary. She learned to read the land like a map. Moss growing on the north side of trees confirmed direction when clouds obscured the North Star. The sound of water meant streams that could hide their scent from tracking dogs. Bird calls indicated whether humans were nearby. She developed a network of allies she could trust absolutely. Thomas Garrett, a Quaker in Delaware, helped hundreds of fugitives and worked closely with Harriet. William Still in Philadelphia documented arrivals and helped fugitives settle into freedom. These allies risked imprisonment and fines to support the Underground Railroad. Harriet also learned to manipulate slave owners' assumptions. They expected enslaved people to be ignorant and cowardly. Harriet used that prejudice. She'd act confused and submissive if questioned, and authorities would dismiss her as harmless. She once traveled south, sitting in a train car reading a book, something enslaved people couldn't do. Someone who knew her approached. Harriet immediately fell asleep in one of her episodes, slumping over the book. The person assumed they were mistaken. The legendary Harriet Tubman wouldn't be openly reading on a train heading into slave territory. Her genius was making the impossible seem ordinary and the extraordinary appear unremarkable. Despite her perfect record, Harriet faced numerous close calls. Slave catchers nearly caught her multiple times. Only quick thinking and divine providence, she believed, kept her free. Once, traveling with a group of fugitives, they encountered a checkpoint on a bridge they needed to cross. Turning back would look suspicious. Crossing meant inspection. Harriet made a split-second decision. She started loudly scolding the group in a thick slave dialect, pretending to be an enslaved woman bringing her master's workers to a neighboring plantation. The guards, hearing her subservient tone and assuming she was too stupid to attempt escape, waved them through. Another time, she saw her former owner on a street in a border town. Recognition meant capture. Harriet grabbed some chickens from a nearby crate and released them, then chased after them frantically. The commotion and her bent posture kept her face hidden. Her former owner walked past without recognizing the formerly enslaved woman he'd once owned. She also survived betrayal. Someone in the network informed slave catchers about an upcoming rescue. Harriet arrived at the designated safe house to find it surrounded. Rather than walking into the trap, she sensed something wrong and diverted to an alternative location she'd scouted earlier. The informant was never identified, but the incident reinforced Harriet's paranoia. Trust was dangerous. Verification was survival. Tracking dogs were a constant threat. Slave owners used bloodhounds trained to hunt humans. The dogs could follow scent trails for miles. Harriet countered this by having fugitives wade through streams, use strong-smelling substances to mask their scent, and travel routes the dogs couldn't follow. She also faced the simple physical dangers of travel. Swamps could swallow you, winter cold could kill, hunger weakened everyone. Injuries had to be endured in silence. No doctor would treat fugitive slaves without reporting them. But the greatest danger was always human betrayal. Some enslaved people, desperate or tortured, would reveal escape plans to their owners. Some free black people, threatened or paid, would inform on Underground Railroad operations. Some white allies, facing legal pressure, would cooperate with authorities. Harriet survived by trusting her instincts, maintaining operational security, and being willing to abandon plans the moment something felt wrong. Her motto became, "I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger." It was a promise she kept through skill, faith, and absolute ruthlessness when necessary. Harriet's rescues sent a powerful message to enslaved communities. Freedom was possible. You didn't have to accept bondage. Someone would help you escape if you were brave enough to try. This message terrified slave owners. Their entire system depended on enslaved people believing escape was impossible, that resistance was futile, that slavery was their permanent condition. Harriet proved them wrong with every successful rescue. Each person she freed became living evidence that the system could be defeated. Enslaved people began preparing for escape, waiting for word that Moses was coming. They gathered supplies, memorized songs, and watched for signals. The Underground Railroad became real in their minds, not just a rumor, but an actual pathway to freedom. Slave owners responded with increased brutality. They tortured suspected fugitives for information. They sold entire families south at the slightest suspicion of escape plans. They hired more slave catchers and increased patrols. But they couldn't stop Harriet. She was too smart, too careful, too blessed by God, depending on whether you believed in divine intervention or human genius. Free black communities raised money to support her work. Abolitionists published accounts of her rescues, using her story to rally support for ending slavery. White churches invited her to speak, and audiences were amazed by this small, humble woman who accomplished extraordinary things. Harriet's speeches were simple and powerful. She didn't have Frederick Douglass's education or eloquence. She spoke in plain language with the directness of someone who'd lived through slavery and fought her way to freedom. "I had reasoned this out in my mind," she told audiences. "There was one of two things I had a right to: liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other. No man should take me alive." She also spoke honestly about the Underground Railroad's difficulties. "I have heard their groans and sighs and seen their tears, and I would give every drop of blood in my veins to free them. Her faith was central to everything. I always told God, I'm going to hold steady onto you, and I know you'll see me through. These speeches raised money and awareness, but Harriet always returned to the dangerous work of actual rescues. Public speaking was necessary, but secondary. Her primary mission was freeing enslaved people, one dangerous trip at a time. In 1861, the Civil War started. Southern states seceded after Abraham Lincoln's election, fearing he would end slavery. They formed the Confederacy and attacked Fort Sumter, beginning 4 years of devastating warfare. Initially, the war wasn't about slavery. Lincoln fought to preserve the Union, not free enslaved people. He feared that making the war about abolition would drive border states into the Confederacy. This infuriated Harriet and other abolitionists. How could you fight a war caused by slavery while refusing to address slavery? How could you ask black people to support the Union while maintaining their bondage? Frederick Douglass led a public campaign demanding that Lincoln make emancipation a war goal and allow black men to fight. Harriet supported this completely. Enslaved people had the most to gain from Union victory. They should be armed and allowed to fight for their own freedom. In 1862, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in rebelling states to be free. It was limited. It didn't free slaves in loyal border states, but it transformed the war's meaning. Now the Union fought explicitly to end slavery. Harriet saw opportunity. The war had brought federal troops into Southern territory. Thousands of enslaved people were fleeing to Union lines, seeking freedom. They needed help, guidance, and support. Harriet went south to support these contrabands, as the military called enslaved people who'd escaped to Union protection. She worked in South Carolina, helping refugee communities organize, establish schools, and build new lives. But she also saw another opportunity. She knew Southern geography from her Underground Railroad work. She knew how to gather intelligence from enslaved communities. She could operate behind enemy lines without being suspected. Harriet Tubman became a spy for the Union Army. Harriet's work for the Union Army was extraordinary. She went behind Confederate lines, gathering intelligence from enslaved people who hated the Confederacy and wanted to help Union forces. Enslaved people knew everything: where Confederate troops were positioned, what supplies were stored, which routes were guarded, where vulnerabilities existed. They told Harriet, and she reported to Union commanders. She also scouted rivers and waterways, mapping routes for military operations. Her knowledge of land navigation from Underground Railroad work made her invaluable for planning raids. Union officers were initially skeptical. A formerly enslaved woman working as a military scout seemed absurd. But Harriet's intelligence was consistently accurate. Officers learned to trust her reports completely. She also recruited and organized a network of black scouts and spies. She trained them in intelligence gathering, taught them how to move undetected, and coordinated their reports into comprehensive military intelligence. In 1863, Harriet did something unprecedented for a woman in American history. She planned and led a military raid. The Combahee River Raid was designed to destroy Confederate supplies and infrastructure while liberating enslaved people from plantations along the river. Harriet guided Union gunboats up the river, directing them to key targets based on intelligence she'd gathered. The raid was spectacularly successful. Union forces destroyed millions of dollars in Confederate supplies, disrupted Southern logistics, and freed over 700 enslaved people in a single operation. Harriet stood on the deck of the lead gunboat as enslaved people rushed toward freedom. She later described the scene. "I never saw such a sight. We laughed and sang. Some of the women would come with twins hanging around their necks. It appears as though I could see them still." This wasn't Underground Railroad work, moving small groups silently through darkness. This was a military operation, conducted in daylight, with gunboats and soldiers, freeing hundreds simultaneously. Harriet had evolved from conductor to general. She'd proven that formerly enslaved people could lead military operations, gather intelligence, and contribute strategically to the war effort. Yet despite this extraordinary service, she received no military pension, no officer's rank, no official recognition. The army paid her sporadically and insufficiently. She supported herself largely by selling pies and root beer to soldiers. The injustice was typical. Black contributions to Union victory were minimized or erased. Black soldiers fought in segregated units for lower pay. Black spies like Harriet worked without recognition or proper compensation. But Harriet didn't fight for recognition. She fought to destroy slavery. Every Confederate supply depot she helped destroy, every piece of intelligence she provided, every enslaved person she freed, these were her true payment. In addition to intelligence work, Harriet served as a nurse for Union forces. Black soldiers and contrabands suffered from diseases, battle wounds, and inadequate medical care. Harriet used her knowledge of herbal medicine to treat them. She worked in military hospitals that were overcrowded, undersupplied, and filled with dying men. Doctors had limited understanding of infection and disease. Many wounded soldiers died from contaminated conditions rather than their injuries. Harriet couldn't change the primitive medical knowledge of the 1860s, but she could provide comfort. She held dying men's hands. She wrote letters to their families. She prayed with those facing death. She also treated illnesses using remedies she'd learned from her mother. Herbal teas for fever, poultices for infections, treatments that sometimes worked better than doctors' methods. Wounded black soldiers especially appreciated her care. White medical staff often ignored or mistreated black patients. Harriet advocated for them, demanded they receive proper treatment, and provided comfort when medicine failed. She saw horrific wounds. The Civil War introduced new military technology, rifled muskets, artillery, mines, that caused devastating injuries. Doctors amputated limbs routinely because they couldn't treat complex wounds. Men died screaming in agony. Harriet witnessed suffering on a scale that overwhelmed even her experience with slavery's brutality. War didn't discriminate, it destroyed bodies regardless of righteousness. Young men who'd enlisted to end slavery died in muddy fields far from home. Yet she never questioned the war's necessity. Slavery was evil. Destroying it required sacrifice. The blood being spilled was payment for generations of enslaved people's stolen lives. "They say we're fighting to save the Union," Harriet told one wounded soldier. "But we're really fighting to prove that all men are created equal. That's worth dying for." The soldier, a young black man who'd lost his leg in battle, nodded weakly. "Miss Harriet, you think we'll win?" "We have to," she replied. "God wouldn't bring us this far to let evil triumph. We'll win. The question is how many of us will die before victory comes." The soldier died that night. Harriet added his name to the long mental list of people she'd seen destroyed by the system she'd spent her life fighting. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. The Civil War was over. The Confederacy was defeated. Slavery was destroyed. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, officially abolished slavery throughout the United States. 4 million people were suddenly, legally free. Harriet was 43 years old. She'd spent her entire adult life fighting slavery, first through the Underground Railroad, then through military service. Now the institution that had defined American life for 250 years was gone. The victory was overwhelming and incomplete. Yes, slavery was legally abolished. But would formerly enslaved people receive land, education, political power? Would America truly embrace racial equality? Or would new forms of oppression replace old ones? Harriet celebrated, but also worried. She knew white America's commitment to black freedom was shallow. White Northerners had opposed slavery's expansion, but didn't necessarily support racial equality. They wanted slavery ended, but didn't want black neighbors, black voters, or black equality. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln on April 14, 1865, deepened these concerns. Lincoln had been imperfect, but increasingly committed to racial justice. His successor, Andrew Johnson, sympathized with former Confederates and opposed black political rights. Reconstruction, the process of rebuilding the South and integrating formerly enslaved people into American society. would determine whether the war's sacrifices meant lasting change or temporary disruption. Harriet returned to Auburn, New York, where she'd bought property before the war. She settled into what she hoped would be a quieter life. She'd fought long enough. Other people could lead the ongoing struggle for equality. But retirement proved impossible. Harriet couldn't stop fighting injustice even when the most obvious injustice, legal slavery, had been defeated. She discovered that formerly enslaved people faced new problems. They were legally free but economically dependent. Most had no land, no education, no resources. Former slave owners exploited this vulnerability, creating systems that mimicked slavery in everything but name. Sharecropping trapped families in debt. Convict leasing enslaved prisoners, most arrested under discriminatory laws targeting black people. Segregation denied basic human dignity. Violence terrorized black communities that dared to vote or assert rights. Harriet had helped destroy legal slavery. Now she had to fight its successor systems. After the war, Harriet dedicated herself to supporting formerly enslaved people and fighting for women's rights. These causes were connected in her mind. Both involved people denied basic human dignity. She worked with organizations supporting aged and disabled formerly enslaved people. Many had worked their entire lives without compensation. Now in old age they had no resources, no pensions, no support. Harriet raised money and established homes where they could live with dignity. She also fought for her own military pension. She'd served the Union Army as a scout, spy, and nurse. She deserved compensation like any veteran. But the government denied her pension for years, claiming insufficient documentation of her service. The real reason was obvious. She was black and female. White male veterans received pensions routinely. Harriet had to fight for decades to receive a fraction of what she'd earned. This struggle revealed post-war America's continuing racism and sexism. The war had ended slavery, but it hadn't ended the devaluation of black lives or women's contributions. Harriet also became active in the women's suffrage movement. She attended conventions, gave speeches, and supported the campaign for women's voting rights. At one convention, she addressed a crowd skeptical about women's capabilities. "I was a conductor on the Underground Railroad for 8 years, and I can say what most conductors can't say. I never ran my train off the track, and I never lost a passenger. Now, if women want to vote, they should have the right." Her argument was simple and powerful. If she could lead military raids, free hundreds from slavery, and outwit slave catchers for years, women were clearly capable of casting votes. She worked alongside Susan B. Anthony and other suffragists, though their relationship had tensions. Some white suffragists were racist, arguing that educated white women deserved votes before black men. Harriet rejected this completely. "Justice is indivisible," she argued. "You can't claim rights for yourself while denying them to others. That's not equality. That's just rearranging oppression." She understood something many white suffragists didn't. Liberation movements must be interconnected. You can't fight sexism while supporting racism. You can't demand voting rights while accepting economic exploitation. In 1896, Harriet purchased 25 acres in Auburn to establish a home for aged and indigent black people. She'd seen too many formerly enslaved people die in poverty after lives of stolen labor. She wanted to provide them dignity in their final years. Fundraising was difficult. Harriet was aging herself, her speaking engagements fewer and less lucrative. But she was as stubborn about this as she'd been about everything else. The home would be built. The Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged opened in 1908. It provided shelter, food, and care for elderly black people who had nowhere else to go. Harriet lived on the property, personally caring for residents despite her own advancing age and declining health. She charged residents nothing or minimal fees based on their ability to pay. The home operated on donations and Harriet's tireless fundraising. It was always financially precarious but never closed. Harriet saw the home as the final piece of her life's work. She'd freed people from slavery, fought to destroy the institution, and now provided care for those who'd survived bondage but aged without resources. Residents called her Aunt Harriet or Moses. Many had been enslaved. Some had escaped via the Underground Railroad, though not necessarily with Harriet's help. They shared a common history of suffering and survival. Harriet would sit with residents, telling stories of her rescues, her faith, her absolute certainty that God had called her to free her people. She never doubted her divine mission, never regretted the risks she'd taken. "Would you do it again?" a younger visitor once asked, "knowing all the danger, all the close calls, all the years of hardship?" Harriet didn't hesitate. "Every time. 1,000 times. Freedom is worth any sacrifice. I'd risk my life 1,000 more times if it meant one more person breathing free air." The home continued operating after Harriet's death, serving Auburn's Black community for decades. It stood as a monument to her belief that liberation required not just freeing people, but supporting them, providing resources, ensuring their dignity. During her final years, Harriet received some recognition for her extraordinary life. Newspapers published articles about her Underground Railroad work. Suffragists honored her contributions to women's rights. Auburn residents respected her as a local hero. But the recognition was incomplete and often disrespectful. White historians questioned her accomplishments, suggesting she'd exaggerated her role. Some claimed she couldn't have rescued that many people, that the stories were myths, that a formerly enslaved woman couldn't have accomplished such extraordinary things. These doubts revealed persistent racism. White people could accept Black suffering, but struggled to accept Black genius. They could acknowledge Harriet as a victim of slavery, but resisted recognizing her as a strategic mastermind who'd outmaneuvered them for years. Harriet also continued fighting for her military pension. She'd applied multiple times, provided testimony, submitted documentation. The government approved a pension in 1899, not for her own service, but as the widow of Nelson Davis, a Black Union soldier she'd married after the war. She received $8 per month. White male veterans received much more. Harriet's widow's pension was an insult disguised as recognition. She finally received a pension for her own military service in 1899, but it was only $20 per month, far less than her contributions deserved. She'd planned military operations, gathered crucial intelligence, freed hundreds, nursed wounded soldiers. $20 monthly was a pittance. Despite these ongoing injustices, Harriet maintained her faith and dignity. She didn't become bitter, didn't retreat into comfortable retirement. She continued fighting for justice until her body could no longer sustain the effort. Her sleeping spells became more frequent and severe. The head injury from her youth, now aggravated by age, caused increasing problems. She underwent brain surgery in 1898 to relieve pressure and pain. She refused anesthesia, instead biting down on a bullet like she'd seen soldiers do during the war. Even in medical crisis, Harriet demonstrated the extraordinary toughness that had sustained her through decades of danger. By 1911, Harriet's health had declined significantly. She was around 89 years old, the exact age uncertain because enslaved people's births weren't recorded precisely. Her body, subjected to decades of harsh labor and dangerous travel, was failing. She moved into the Harriet Tubman Home for the Aged, the institution she'd created to serve others now sheltering her. She occupied a room like any other resident, cared for by staff she'd hired, supported by the community she'd served. Visitors came regularly. People wanted to meet the legendary Moses, to hear her stories firsthand, to sit in the presence of someone who'd changed American history. Harriet welcomed them all, still telling stories, still testifying about God's faithfulness. She remained mentally sharp even as her body weakened. She could recount her rescues in vivid detail, specific routes, particular dangers, individual people she'd freed. Her memory was extraordinary, her faith unshaken. "I look back and I see the footprints of God," she told one visitor. "Every dangerous moment, every close call, He was there. I never could have done this alone." She also reflected on what remained undone. Slavery was abolished, but racial justice remained distant. Black people could vote in theory, but violence and discrimination prevented many from exercising that right. Economic oppression continued. Social segregation was legal and enforced. "We freed the body," Harriet said, "but the mind, that's still in chains for many people. Freedom isn't just about laws, it's about believing you're equal, demanding your rights, refusing to accept injustice." She worried about younger generations who hadn't experienced slavery directly. Would they understand what had been fought for? Would they continue the struggle, or would they accept comfortable oppression? "Don't ever forget," she urged young visitors. "Don't ever accept being treated as less than fully human. I didn't risk my life so future generations could bow their heads to white people. Stand up, demand equality, fight." Her final public appearance was at a suffrage convention in 1911. Though weak, she insisted on attending. She stood before the audience and said simply, "I gave my life to freedom. Now I pass that responsibility to you." The audience gave her a standing ovation. Many wept, understanding they were seeing a living connection to the fight against slavery, witnessing someone who'd personally battled America's greatest evil. Harriet Tubman died on March 10, 1913, at approximately 91 years old. She died at the Harriet Tubman home in Auburn, New York, surrounded by friends and supporters who'd gathered to honor her final hours. Her last words were reportedly, "I go to prepare a place for you." She was quoting Jesus from the Bible, expressing her faith that death was merely transition to eternal freedom. Harriet had lived to see slavery destroyed, to witness constitutional amendments granting citizenship and voting rights to formerly enslaved people, to help establish foundations for continued struggle toward racial justice. She hadn't lived to see women gain voting rights. That would come in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. She hadn't seen the civil rights movement of the 1960s, the ongoing battles against systemic racism, the continued work of building true equality. But she'd done her part. She'd risked everything, accomplished the impossible, and inspired generations. Her funeral was held with military honors, a rare recognition for a woman, especially a black woman. Auburn residents, both black and white, attended in large numbers. Suffragists sent tributes. Civil rights organizations honored her legacy. But the military honors were ironic. The same government that had denied her proper pension for decades now recognized her with a military funeral. Better late than never, but the injustice remained. She was buried at Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn. Her grave was marked with a simple stone that would later be replaced with more elaborate memorials. Newspapers across the country published obituaries. The New York Times noted her Underground Railroad work and military service. Black newspapers published longer, more personal tributes, recognizing her as one of the greatest freedom fighters in American history. But many details of her life remained unknown or disputed. She'd operated in secrecy for so long, maintaining operational security even decades after slavery ended. Some of her accomplishments were documented, but many existed only in oral tradition, in stories passed through black communities. Harriet herself had contributed to this. She'd never sought fame. She'd avoided detailed interviews that might reveal methods slave catchers could study. She'd protected her sources and techniques even after they were no longer necessary. So she died as she'd lived, partially hidden, fully committed, absolutely convinced that God had called her to free her people, and that she'd fulfilled that calling faithfully. Harriet Tubman left behind more than memory. She left a blueprint for resistance, a model of courage, and proof that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when committed to justice. Her tactics influenced future civil rights activists. The Underground Railroad's methods, secrecy, coded messages, networks of safe houses, willingness to use force when necessary, reappeared in later liberation movements. Her insistence that freedom required action, not patience, challenged comfortable narratives about gradual progress. Harriet didn't ask slave owners nicely to free enslaved people. She didn't wait for white people to recognize black humanity. She took freedom, rescued others, and forced America to confront slavery's evil. Her life demonstrated that formerly enslaved people weren't victims waiting to be saved. They were agents of their own liberation, capable of strategic thinking, military leadership, and sustained resistance against seemingly overwhelming power. Harriet also showed the interconnection between different justice movements. She fought slavery, supported women's suffrage, advocated for economic justice, and created institutions to serve the vulnerable. She understood that liberation required addressing multiple oppressions simultaneously. Her faith was central but not passive. She didn't pray for freedom while accepting bondage. She prayed, then acted. She believed God called her to free her people, then spent decades doing exactly that, risking her life repeatedly. This combination of deep faith and radical action challenges both religious passivity and secular dismissiveness toward spirituality. Harriet's God demanded justice and empowered resistance. Her Christianity was a liberating force, not an opiate. Her willingness to use violence when necessary also challenges simplistic narratives about nonviolent resistance. Harriet carried a gun. She threatened to shoot fugitives who wanted to turn back. She supported John Brown's armed resistance. She led military raids. She understood that oppressive systems sometimes respond only to force. Moral persuasion has limits when dealing with people who profit from injustice, yet she also demonstrated strategic restraint. She avoided violence when escape was possible. She used intelligence rather than force whenever practical. Violence was a tool, not a principle, deployed when necessary, avoided when possible. In the decades after Harriet's death, her story was often sanitized or forgotten. White historians minimized her accomplishments. School textbooks mentioned her briefly, if at all. The complex, fierce woman who'd threatened to shoot retreating fugitives became a simplified folk hero. But Black communities remembered. Grandmothers told grandchildren about Moses. Churches honored her on special occasions. Civil rights activists studied her tactics and drew inspiration from her courage. During the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, activists explicitly connected their work to Harriet's legacy. Freedom riders following dangerous routes through the South echoed Underground Railroad conductors. Organizers using safe houses mirrored Harriet's networks. Leaders demanding immediate justice rather than gradual change channeled her impatience with oppression. In recent decades, Harriet has received more appropriate recognition. Schools, libraries, and ships bear her name. Monuments honor her in multiple cities. In 2016, the Treasury Department announced plans to feature her on the $20 bill, though that plan has faced delays. Historians have worked to recover accurate details of her life, separating fact from myth, while recognizing that some uncertainty is inevitable for someone who operated in secrecy. Academic research has confirmed her extraordinary accomplishments while acknowledging gaps in documentation. Popular culture has also embraced Harriet's story. Books, films, and documentaries introduce new generations to her life. Young people learn about the woman who made 19 trips into slave territory, freed 70 people personally, and never lost a passenger. But commercialized celebration can obscure radical reality. Harriet wasn't a safe, comfortable hero. She was dangerous. She threatened the social order. She used violence. She broke laws. She demanded immediate, complete justice rather than gradual, comfortable progress. True honor requires acknowledging the full complexity of who she was, not just the brave conductor of the Underground Railroad, but the armed militant, the military strategist, the woman willing to shoot anyone who threatened freedom. It requires recognizing that she fought a war. Not metaphorically, but literally. She waged war against slavery through the Underground Railroad, through military service during the Civil War, through her continued advocacy for justice afterward. And it requires continuing her work. Harriet died 90 years before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. She never saw the end of legal segregation, never witnessed a black president, never experienced anything approaching racial equality. The fight she began continues. Different forms, different tactics, but the same fundamental struggle, establishing that all people possess equal dignity and deserve equal rights. Harriet Tubman's voice echoes through American history with undeniable power. Her life forces uncomfortable questions that remain relevant today. If freedom requires action rather than patience, what does that demand of people facing current injustices? If Harriet was willing to risk death for liberation, what are we willing to risk for justice? If she couldn't rest while others remained enslaved, can we rest while oppression continues? Her most famous quote, often misattributed but capturing her spirit, addresses this directly. I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were slaves. This statement indicts comfortable oppression. Some bondage is physical chains, but some is mental, accepting unjust systems as natural, believing propaganda that justifies inequality, choosing security over freedom. Harriet's life was a sustained rejection of that acceptance. From childhood, she recognized slavery as evil. As an adult, she acted on that recognition, despite extreme danger. Until her death, she fought every form of injustice she encountered. She demonstrated that one person, starting with nothing except determination and faith, can change the world. She was born enslaved, owned as property, denied education and rights. From that position of absolute powerlessness, she became one of the most effective freedom fighters in American history. She proved that formerly enslaved people weren't broken victims, but fully capable human beings who could outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast those who claimed superiority. Every successful rescue was evidence disproving racist pseudoscience about black inferiority. She showed that women could lead, could fight, could demonstrate courage equal to any man. At a time when women couldn't vote and were considered naturally submissive, Harriet commanded military raids and threatened violence against anyone who endangered her missions. Most importantly, she lived her entire life as if freedom mattered more than comfort, as if justice was worth any sacrifice, as if her faith in God required her to free His people rather than wait for divine intervention without human action. When Harriet Tubman died, slavery was legally abolished, but racial justice remained incomplete. More than a century later, that work continues. Her voice still speaks. I go to prepare a place for you. She prepared a place in freedom for 70 people she personally rescued. She prepared a place in American consciousness for the truth about slavery's evil and formerly enslaved people's capabilities. She prepared a place in history for the recognition that liberation requires courage, sacrifice, and sustained commitment. And she prepared a place in the ongoing struggle for justice, a place for anyone willing to risk comfort for righteousness, willing to act rather than merely sympathize, willing to become their generation's Moses, leading people from bondage to freedom. Harriet Tubman was born Araminta Ross, property of a Maryland slave owner, valued at a few $100s. She died, Harriet Tubman, General Tubman, Moses, one of the greatest Americans who ever lived, worth more than all the plantations that had tried to contain her. She was born enslaved and died free, having freed hundreds and inspired millions. The house of bondage couldn't hold her. The slave catchers couldn't catch her. Death couldn't silence her. Her voice still speaks. I freed 1,000 slaves. I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were slaves. Listen to that voice. Hear the challenge. Continue the work. Freedom is never given. It must be taken. Justice doesn't arrive on its own schedule. It must be demanded and fought for and defended constantly. Harriet Tubman knew this. She lived it. And her life remains a testament to the power of one person who refuses to accept injustice, who acts despite fear, who risks everything for freedom. She was Moses. And her people, remember.